Lewis Hamilton has just dropped a bombshell on Instagram. He's stepping away from Ferrari. Is this the end of his time in Formula One, or is he planning a shocking switch to another team? Don't miss a second. This video reveals the unexpected path ahead for Lewis Hamilton. Subscribe only if you want to stay updated with the latest breaking news about F1 races. Lewis Hamilton has just sent a shockwave through the world of Formula One that few could have anticipated and even fewer were prepared to handle. In a moment of unfiltered truth, delivered directly through his personal Instagram account, the multiple-time world champion shattered expectations, traditions, and the illusion of harmony that surrounded his position at Ferrari. His decision to sever ties with the most iconic name in motorsport was not only abrupt, it was explosive, deeply personal, and emotionally raw. It was not an announcement. It was a reckoning. He didn't stage a press conference. He didn't appear on camera with a composed expression, surrounded by flashing cameras and PR agents whispering lines. He chose instead to speak directly, unmediated, on a platform he controls, with nothing more than a blank canvas and carefully chosen words. The post began with a single jarring sentence that instantly pierced through the noise. "I gave it everything, but I can't continue like this." That opening struck with the weight of a confession, not from a defeated athlete, but from a man reclaiming his autonomy. Subscribe only if you want to stay updated with the latest breaking news about F1 races. What followed was not a farewell but a revelation. Hamilton opened up about the suffocating atmosphere he had been enduring behind the velvet curtain of Formula One's most storied organization. He described a culture that felt more like psychological warfare than collaboration, a climate thick with control, manipulation, and silent hostility. His words painted a picture of an internal ecosystem where pressure wasn't about results, but about dominance. He said he felt constantly cornered, monitored, and second-guessed, even as he poured every ounce of experience, dedication, and talent into the project. He called out the leadership, particularly Frederick Vasseur, not with vulgarity or rage, but with clarity and precision. He accused him of instituting a regime that wore down confidence, rather than encouraging it, of wielding authority like a weapon, not a compass. Hamilton wrote about long nights questioning his worth, not because of poor performance, but because of the perpetual cloud of doubt that hung over his head every time he entered a meeting room. He spoke of how he came to Ferrari to build, to elevate, to leave a legacy, only to find himself boxed in, isolated, and marginalized. He explained that he was routinely excluded from pivotal discussions. Technical choices were made without his voice. Strategic decisions were set in motion without his insight. And when he did speak, his opinions were often acknowledged with nods but never implemented. He expressed how even his victories felt hollow because they were met with polite applause instead of true respect. It became clear that despite all he had achieved, his presence was treated as a liability rather than an asset, a distraction instead of a leader. Subscribe only if you want to stay updated with the latest breaking news about F1 races. Then came the most anticipated and perhaps most heartbreaking part of his message, the fracture between him and Charles Leclerc. Hamilton finally addressed, with poetic restraint and emotional intensity, the disintegration of what was once hailed as a promising partnership. He didn't lash out or cast blame directly, but the narrative was unmistakable. There was no unity, no synergy, and certainly no equal footing. He described an environment where alliances were formed, loyalties were clear, and he was never truly embraced as part of the inner circle. He hinted that decisions around car development began leaning consistently in one direction. He stated that feedback loops were asymmetric, with Leclerc's data prioritized and his own telemetry often ignored or overridden. He talked about walking into the garage and feeling like a visitor in his own domain, surrounded by technicians whose allegiance had already been claimed. What was supposed to be a partnership had turned into a cold war. He wrote that the silence between them grew louder with every passing race, every shared podium devoid of conversation, every briefing that ended in glances rather than words. Team insiders, long suspected of whispering to the media, are now confirming details that support Hamilton's narrative. Some say he was kept out of pre-race strategic summits, others suggest that certain setups were adjusted mid-weekend to suit the other car. One report claims that Hamilton privately confronted Leclerc after the Canadian Grand Prix, demanding clarity, only to be met with indifference. That moment, sources say, broke something in him, not just trust, but hope. As the internet continues to convulse in response, Ferrari remains silent. Their press team has gone dark, and no senior figure has made themselves available. Charles Leclerc has made no public comment. The digital world has erupted. Hashtags related to Hamilton's departure dominate timelines, fan theories run rampant, and major sponsors are reportedly seeking emergency briefings. This wasn't supposed to happen, and certainly not like this. Ferrari, a team synonymous with control, prestige, and carefully crafted mythos, has been exposed by its own driver in a way no one saw coming. Beyond the immediate media circus, rival teams have already begun mobilizing. Mercedes is rumored to be considering the impossible, another reunion. Audi, eager to make a bold entrance into F1, could accelerate its timetable for the chance to build a project around Hamilton. Aston Martin is also reportedly in play, with quiet inquiries already sent to his representatives. Some whisper even more dramatic options: an entire season off, a sabbatical, time away to reset and reflect. But if there's one thing clear from Hamilton's message, it's this: he's not done racing. He's done being diminished. What makes this moment even more poignant is how Hamilton framed it, not as a rejection of competition or adversity, but of betrayal and disillusionment. He reminded everyone that racing is more than machinery. It's about relationships, belief, and trust. And when those things are fractured, no amount of horsepower or heritage can fill the void. He emphasized that wearing red meant something to him, that he didn't arrive at Ferrari chasing attention, but chasing greatness. He came to contribute, not just to drive. But he discovered too late that intention alone isn't enough when the system sees you as an outsider from day one. The message ends not with bitterness, but with liberation. His final words resonate like a final lap driven with purpose, not for the trophy, but for the principle: I thought I was here to build something lasting. But I've realized I was placed here to serve a narrative that was never mine. I'm choosing myself again. Not out of anger, but out of necessity. There is no timetable yet for what happens next. No one knows if he'll be back on the grid before the season ends, or if he'll take time to regroup. But what everyone agrees on is that this moment, this message, and this man have just changed the way the world views driver-team relationships forever. This wasn't just a resignation. It was a roar. Lewis Hamilton spoke without hesitation, stripping away the layers of performance, PR polish, and media etiquette. He didn't just express frustration. He laid bare his sense of isolation and emotional abandonment. His remarks carried the weight of months of internal tension, months of watching his presence within the team shrink while his voice grew quieter in the room. The man who joined Ferrari with unmatched experience and aspirations of glory wasn't just hurt by the recent decisions. He felt betrayed by the silence, the distance, the coldness from the one person who should have stood by him during adversity: his teammate. A genuine partner in this sport offers more than talent. They offer presence in hard times, Hamilton said. But Charles distanced himself. When I needed someone to acknowledge the fight, he disappeared into indifference. That silence meant more than any word he could have said. It wasn't just about gestures or words, though. It was about energy, chemistry, trust. That invisible thread between drivers in the same garage who are supposed to build each other up, not quietly compete for control of the team's direction. Hamilton's view wasn't shaped by one moment. It was an accumulation of slights, dismissals, and a slowly eroding sense of belonging. After the Monaco Grand Prix, something fundamental shifted. What should have been just another strategic discussion during the race became a statement, a declaration that decisions would now be made with someone else's championship hopes in mind. Lewis wasn't merely outmaneuvered, he was excluded. The choices made that day didn't just alter the outcome of the race. They made it obvious to him that Ferrari had already chosen their narrative, and it no longer had him in the starring role. What the fans witnessed was the on-track spectacle. What they didn't witness was the quiet unraveling of a partnership behind the scenes. After that Grand Prix, when Hamilton finished his interviews, there was a moment that very few saw, but those who did wouldn't forget. He wasn't his usual composed self. He walked slowly, his posture slightly slumped, his racing suit only halfway fastened, gloves still on, helmet dangling from his hand like a weight. He didn't greet anyone. He didn't smile. He looked as though he were carrying a storm inside him. Then, in the hallway, he came face to face with Frederic Vasseur. The man who had brought him into Ferrari, who had promised a new era, stood a few feet away, waiting. The exchange wasn't loud. There were no dramatic gestures. No shouting. Just eye contact, brief, piercing, and heavy with meaning. Words were exchanged, but they were private, barely above a whisper. Observers say Hamilton didn't pause long. He nodded, slowly, with a kind of finality that felt heavier than any radio message, and walked past. Vasseur didn't move. That moment crystallized what had already become obvious to many inside the team. Something fundamental had fractured. Hamilton, who had begun the season energized and hopeful, had been quietly pushed to the periphery. People began to notice he wasn't included in key meetings, that his feedback during briefings didn't carry the same weight. Development paths were increasingly tailored to Leclerc's preferences. Even subtle things, communication tone over the radio, body language from engineers, shifted. His presence was acknowledged, but not embraced. His role was respected, but not prioritized. He wasn't treated like a leader, he was treated like a guest. Those closest to him say the change has taken an emotional toll. He still delivers, still drives with passion, but something in his eyes has changed. He's no longer performing for the team, he's driving for himself. One longtime engineer admitted, he hasn't checked out, but he's definitely disconnected. It's like he knows he's not part of the inner circle anymore. He doesn't fake it, he just does his job and leaves. What once felt like a collaborative effort has morphed into a quiet power struggle. Not through sabotage or conflict, but through exclusion, through silence, through absence. And Charles Leclerc? To the outside world, he remains the golden boy, skilled, polished, media-friendly. But internally, the perception is more nuanced. While some admire his focus and consistency, others whisper about a shift in his demeanor. He's become more guarded, more possessive of his influence within the team. He doesn't ask for control, but he doesn't have to. The structure bends toward him naturally now. People defer to him. Strategies lean in his direction. And whether intentional or not, the team has begun to shape itself around his needs, not Hamilton's. That shift has made the gap between the drivers feel impossible to close. They no longer speak outside of formal obligations. The few moments they're captured together are filled with tension you can almost feel through the screen. They stand near each other, but never together. They avoid direct eye contact. They walk different routes to the grid. They celebrate separately. One gives post-race interviews smiling next to his car, the other disappears before cameras can find him. They exist in two separate spheres, connected only by the red uniforms they wear and the machines they drive. Hamilton's willingness to address this publicly wasn't out of recklessness, it was a final act of honesty. After months of carrying it in silence, he chose to voice the truth as he experienced it. Not to cause chaos, but to reclaim control of his story. He's watched narratives build around him without his input, watched decisions made without his knowledge, watched moments that should have been shared become solitary. His frustration isn't just about competitiveness, it's about dignity, about fairness, about not being treated like a placeholder while another driver takes the spotlight with the quiet consent of leadership. The Formula One world is split. Supporters rally around Hamilton's transparency, calling it brave, long overdue, a reminder that even icons are human. Critics argue it's disruptive, that his words risk unraveling team morale in a season where unity matters most. But no one can ignore it. His voice still commands attention. And what's emerging is a portrait of a champion refusing to fade into silence, unwilling to let politics and favoritism write the final lines of his legacy. This isn't the end for Lewis Hamilton, but it might be the breaking point. Whether he stays another season, makes a dramatic switch, or walks away from Ferrari altogether, he has made it clear that he will not compromise who he is. He didn't come to Maranello to serve someone else's ambition. He came to build something historic, and when that promise began to erode, he chose to speak up rather than play along. He may be isolated within the team, but he's more connected than ever to the truth of what he values. He doesn't want pity, he wants clarity. He doesn't ask for sympathy, he demands fairness. And through it all, he remains driven, not by revenge or resentment, but by the same fire that brought him to the top of the sport in the first place. Even if the walls close in, even if the cheers grow faint, Lewis Hamilton will not disappear. His story is still being written, and he's not handing the pen to anyone else. The tension was suffocating even before a single word had been exchanged. The walls felt closer, the air heavier, the silence more deafening than any shouting match could have ever been. There was a strange stillness in the Ferrari hospitality area, the kind that grips the body when something monumental is about to unravel, not with noise, but with quiet force. people nearby weren't just watching, they were bracing. It was clear from the moment Lewis Hamilton and Fred Vasseur locked eyes that something serious, something irreversible, was about to be said. Vasseur, known for his calm demeanor and managerial discipline, didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His posture was stiff, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his jaw clenched in a way that betrayed the calm his words tried to project. He didn't waste time with pleasantries or indirect suggestions. What came out of his mouth was direct, clinical, and utterly devoid of softness. "You're over-processing everything. Someone with your experience should be leading, not hesitating." The statement wasn't shouted, it was delivered with surgical precision, the kind that slices deeper than rage ever could. It wasn't just a critique. It was a dismissal of Hamilton's instincts, of his method, of his entire approach to the season. And Hamilton, standing there not as just a driver but as one of the most accomplished figures in the history of the sport, understood the implication immediately. His expression didn't shift, but his eyes darkened. Not with anger, but with something much heavier. The weight of unacknowledged effort. The fatigue of feeling like a visitor in a team he thought would welcome his leadership. When he finally responded, his tone wasn't sharp. It was measured, hollowed, as if he'd been holding these words in for longer than anyone realized. "You keep asking for more," he said, his voice steady, "but offer less in return. Less backing, less loyalty, less connection." Those words didn't echo in the room, they sank. Deeply, irrevocably. The staff nearby didn't move. Some looked down. Others froze. No one dared interrupt. That exchange pierced through months of fake smiles and scripted interviews. It was the truth, spoken out loud. One team insider described it later as the point where the foundation cracked. It wasn't dramatic. It was silent devastation. A mutual realization that the partnership had frayed beyond repair. Then, in an almost theatrical twist of timing, Charles Leclerc stepped into view. No announcement. No warning. Just a sudden presence that instantly raised the emotional temperature of the space. There was no dialogue between them. None was needed. The body language said everything. Hamilton turned his head slightly, just enough to see Leclerc approaching. And then, with a movement that was equal parts respectful and exhausted, he extended his hand. The gesture wasn't forced. It was honest. Maybe even a final attempt at reconciliation, or, at the very least, maintaining professional decency. But Leclerc didn't slow down. His gaze didn't shift. His footsteps didn't falter. He walked past Hamilton as if the hand wasn't there. As if the man reaching out to him didn't exist. Not even a flicker of acknowledgement. And that, according to multiple witnesses, was the true breaking point. The snub wasn't loud, but it screamed. It didn't make headlines that day, it wasn't televised, but everyone who saw it knew they had witnessed the implosion of something that once held enormous promise. Hamilton didn't withdraw his hand immediately. He let the moment breathe. Then, with eyes still following Leclerc's back as he vanished down the hallway, he turned slowly toward Vasseur. No anger. No theatrics. Just a statement, laced with decades of experience and the unmistakable sting of betrayal. "There's your star pupil. Hope he gives you what I clearly never could." The words weren't just bitter, they were drenched in history. In all the missed opportunities, all the ignored advice, all the subtle signs that he'd never truly been embraced by this team the way he had once been by others. Ferrari may have spoken of a new era when they brought him on, but in his heart, Hamilton had come to believe that he was merely a temporary solution. A headline signing. A symbolic move. Never the centerpiece. That afternoon, everything began to shift. The inner workings of the Scuderia started to grind differently. Where once there had been trust, now there was suspicion. Where collaboration had existed, there was now a quiet withdrawal. Meetings became colder. Information flowed more selectively. Engineers began to gravitate subtly, some toward Charles, others toward Lewis, but no longer as one united force. The garage had split, not in words, but in atmosphere. Pit wall discussions lost their flow. Race strategy meetings became tense, often filled with unspoken hesitation. The mechanics, usually full of light banter and focused energy, now operated like they were walking on shattered glass. The harmony Ferrari had so carefully tried to orchestrate with their dream team pairing was now a facade. Everyone knew it. They just didn't say it out loud. Leclerc, outwardly poised, began carrying the invisible burden of being the chosen one. He may have won the standoff, but the cost was clear. The environment around him became more pressurized. Every mistake scrutinized. Every win, a necessity rather than a celebration. And Hamilton, while still professional, still pushing the limits on track, became quieter. Not in speed, but in presence. He did his work. He drove his laps. But the spark had dulled. The ambition was still there, but the belief in the mission had vanished. Media whispers turned into pointed questions. Why wasn't Ferrari delivering? Why did two of the most talented drivers in the world seem so disconnected? Why were radio calls increasingly tense or outright vague? Nothing could be hidden anymore. Even the fans noticed. The once exciting narrative of Ferrari's resurgence had been overtaken by speculation, body language breakdowns, and rumors of backroom arguments. Inside closed doors at Maranello, senior figures tried to hold things together. PR campaigns, carefully crafted statements, internal reviews, but it was all reactionary. The damage had already embedded itself into the core. Trust had dissolved. And Hamilton, who had joined the team with hope of writing a legacy, now found himself quietly preparing to leave behind a chapter that would never feel complete. Those closest to him said he started keeping his thoughts private, far more than before. Not bitterly, but protectively. As if every word he didn't say was a form of survival. In conversations with trusted allies, he reportedly referred to his time at Ferrari as a lesson more than a legacy. The dream, it seemed, had not just ended, it had transformed into something far colder. What happened in that hallway would never be broadcast. It wouldn't be uploaded, clipped, or analyzed in slow motion. But for those who were there, those who heard it, saw it, felt it, it was unforgettable. It wasn't just the collapse of a relationship between teammates. It was the visible, undeniable unraveling of a vision that had once captured the imagination of millions. And while the engines will keep roaring, and the races will keep coming, something inside Ferrari broke that day. And some things, once broken, don't heal. They haunt. Hamilton didn't merely leave the pit lane after the race. He departed as if fleeing a moment that had stripped him of everything. His body moved, but his spirit lagged behind. Every motion felt heavy, almost reluctant, as though his soul was dragging through wet cement. He kept his gaze rooted to the pavement beneath him, not because of humility or exhaustion, but because lifting it might have shattered whatever fragile composure he still possessed. No one dared to stop him. Not a single word was uttered in his direction. Even the bravest journalists hesitated, and the crowd's roar gradually dissolved into uneasy quiet. The usual buzz of post-race activity, the clamor of wrenches, the chatter of strategy teams, the controlled chaos of a debrief, seemed to mute itself as he passed by. He didn't acknowledge anyone. Not the familiar faces offering sympathetic looks, not the engineers silently reviewing data, not even the fans pressing up against the barriers holding hand-painted signs. They all became part of the background, blurred and meaningless in a world that no longer felt like it belonged to him. He ascended the stairs into the motorhome slowly, his legs steady but his energy clearly drained. The door closed behind him with a deliberate thud that sounded less like privacy and more like surrender. He walked down the narrow corridor and entered his private suite without removing his race gear. The room, a minimalist cocoon designed for brief moments of solitude between interviews and commitments, suddenly felt like the only place in a universe where he could escape the weight of his name. The door locked behind him with a quiet mechanical click, and from that moment on, there was nothing. Minutes passed. Then longer. Almost 90 in total. Not a sound came from inside. Mechanics knocked cautiously at first, then more insistently. No response. An engineer even tried calling his phone, twice. Voicemail. No lights changed behind the slim door. Some staff began whispering nervously. Others paced nearby, not knowing whether to leave or stay. Hamilton wasn't just hiding. He was unreachable. Closed off. Not out of rage, but something far more dangerous, emotional paralysis. As if something inside him had finally given up trying. This wasn't about frustration with a car that underperformed. This wasn't about being beaten on track. This was something far more personal, more existential. He wasn't angry. He was hollowed out. And no one knew how to reach him. Until Toto Wolff arrived. He hadn't been seen at the garage for hours. His scheduled responsibilities had ended earlier that afternoon, and most assumed he had left the venue altogether, likely to his hotel or a corporate dinner. But he hadn't. He'd remained in the background, attending quiet meetings, fulfilling minor engagements. And then, word reached him, discreetly, through trusted voices, that something was seriously wrong. That Hamilton had vanished into himself. That he wasn't speaking to anyone. That the atmosphere inside the motorhome had grown so tense and quiet, it felt like a hospital waiting room. Toto didn't wait for further clarification. He stood, excused himself from whatever discussion he'd been in, and left. Alone. No assistant trailed behind him. No PR manager attempted to spin the moment. He walked through the paddock without speaking. His pace was brisk, his expression unreadable. But those who saw him said there was something fierce in his eyes. Not panic. Not anxiety. Something else, urgency fused with empathy. He entered the motorhome without saying a word. Passed the lounge. Walked to the private corridor. Stood outside the closed door. And unlike the others, he didn't knock. He simply placed his hand on the panel, leaned in, and said, in a voice so soft it was almost reverent, "It's me." A pause followed. It stretched just long enough to make everyone holding their breath believe it wouldn't work. And then, the door unlocked. Inside, the air was heavy. The light dim. Hamilton sat hunched forward on the small bench, helmet off but still dressed in his race suit, eyes red but dry now, as though he had run out of tears. The silence in the room was profound, not empty, but full of everything that hadn't been said for weeks, maybe even years. Toto closed the door gently behind him and sat opposite. He didn't speak immediately. He didn't move closer. He let the silence breathe. Because sometimes, silence is the only language deep enough to hold pain. Then, slowly, Lewis lifted his gaze. His voice cracked but didn't shake. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore." Toto didn't flinch. He'd seen Lewis at his highest. He'd watched him pull impossible performances out of cars that had no business being at the front. He had celebrated with him, defended him, battled for him in meetings, in press conferences, and in boardrooms. But he had never seen him like this. Fragile. Not because he lacked strength, but because he had carried too much of it for too long, for too many people. Toto finally responded, not as a team executive, not as a businessman, but as someone who deeply understood what this moment meant. "You don't owe us anything," he said quietly. "You've already given everything you had. You've broken records, changed history, inspired generations. That's more than anyone ever asked for." Hamilton closed his eyes, breathing shakily. The words weren't just comforting. They were liberating. "If you want to walk away," Toto continued, "I'll back you. Fully. And if you want to stay, even in a different capacity, just as a reserve driver, or as a mentor, or whatever you need, I'll make sure you feel respected again. No expectations. No pressure. Just space to be you." There was another long silence. Then Lewis looked up again, this time not as a competitor, not as a figurehead, but as a man who had finally been granted permission to feel what he'd suppressed for years. He nodded slightly, the movement subtle but profound. That might be the first offer that didn't come with a price. Those words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They sat between them like truth, undeniable and raw. What emerged from that room wasn't a decision or a new chapter. It was something quieter, something deeper. It was mutual understanding. Mutual grace. In a sport built on speed, dominance, and image, this was a moment of stillness. Of recognition. Of remembering that underneath the machinery, the data, the marketing, and the legacy, there are human beings trying to breathe under the weight of their own greatness. No cameras caught them leaving. No official statement followed. But every person in the paddock that evening sensed something had shifted. The silence surrounding the motorhome no longer felt tense. It felt sacred. And that, more than any result, might have been the most meaningful moment of the entire season. The entire Formula One landscape has been thrown into absolute disarray by a development so startling, so profoundly unexpected, that it has left fans, experts, insiders, and competitors in a collective state of shock. Lewis Hamilton, a name synonymous with relentless excellence, unshakable determination, and generational talent, has decided to terminate his relationship with Scuderia Ferrari. This isn't just a parting of ways, it's a dramatic exit from an alliance many believed would go down as the defining partnership of the modern era. The separation isn't just professional. It's philosophical. It's personal. And it has sent shockwaves beyond racing. Hamilton's decision, delivered not through a press conference but via a direct and emotionally charged social media post, has sparked a wildfire of reactions and emotions. He didn't mince words. He didn't couch his feelings in euphemisms or diplomatic vagueness. His message pierced through the noise, saying more in a few lines than most careers say in years. They asked me to abandon who I am. They praised flawlessness but dismissed sincerity. They rewarded quietness and rejected conviction. That's not how I built my legacy, and it's certainly not how I'll close this chapter. Those words weren't just read, they were absorbed like oxygen in a room full of tension. They ignited an instant storm of commentary across every communication channel available. Analysts froze mid-broadcast to address the bombshell. Supporters began posting tributes, heartfelt messages, video montages, and emotional breakdowns of what they interpreted behind every sentence. It felt like a cultural earthquake, the type of moment that splits time into before and after. What had been rumors hidden in shadows had now become a public reckoning. The most deafening sound, however, came from Italy: silence. Ferrari has yet to issue even the briefest acknowledgement. No comments from the team principal, no input from the communication staff, not even a recycled quote from upper management. The absence of any response has only intensified the scrutiny. In this information void, speculation has blossomed, with journalists piecing together timelines and insider reports to uncover where this deeply public fracture originated. Inside sources whisper of creative tension that began simmering during the early flyaway rounds. Arguments about car development priorities, missed targets in aerodynamic upgrades, and diverging perspectives on leadership culture reportedly widened into unbridgeable gaps. Multiple engineers are said to have clashed with Hamilton's outspoken nature, seeing his vocal feedback as disruptive rather than constructive. Several individuals close to the situation claim he was often left out of crucial debriefs, treated more like a visiting icon than a central pillar of the team's future. Beyond technical friction, it's the cultural misalignment that many believe ultimately tore this partnership apart. Hamilton, known for his willingness to speak out on matters beyond racing, social justice, diversity, mental health, sustainability, reportedly found himself in an environment that prioritized image control and traditional structures over progressive values. He was expected to fit into a mold shaped decades ago, one that didn't have room for individuality, dissent, or activism. And that pressure, according to those familiar with the dynamic, became unbearable. Now, with Hamilton having taken such a powerful stance, the team must face a reality it was seemingly unprepared for. Reports indicate that Carlos Sainz, who had already begun disengaging from Ferrari's internal operations following the announcement of his exit, may now be approached with urgency to return, not as a long-term solution, but as a stabilizing force in a moment of upheaval. Parallel discussions have reportedly begun with Ferrari driver academy prospects, evaluating whether any of the young talents, possibly Ollie Behrman or even Kimi Antonelli, might be thrust into the spotlight earlier than anticipated. Behind the scenes, Mercedes appears to be re-engaging with quiet intent. While there is no indication that Hamilton is preparing to return to the grid in a full-time capacity, there are murmurs that Brackley is preparing a high-level role that would reunite him with the team in a position of trust and influence. Sources suggest it may be a hybrid position, part brand ambassador, part strategic consultant, possibly involving mentorship of younger drivers and alignment with Mercedes' evolving identity as a brand committed to innovation, ethics, and inclusion. Toto Wolff's brief public comment, "He has never been just a driver to us," felt less like a compliment and more like an open door. What makes this entire situation more captivating is that it transcends racing. It speaks to broader themes: standing firm in one's identity, resisting conformity, and choosing personal values over professional optics. Hamilton's exit is not being interpreted as a retreat or a resignation, but as a declaration. He's drawing a line in the sand, reminding everyone watching that success without authenticity is hollow. It's a message that's resonating not just with sports fans, but with anyone who has ever felt pressured to trade their voice for approval. Reactions from public figures have continued pouring in. Icons from music, film, and fashion have taken to social platforms to express solidarity. Prominent athletes from other disciplines have praised the bravery of such a public stand. Mental health advocates have lauded the transparency. Educational institutions are even beginning to discuss his message in the context of leadership and identity. What could have been a simple contract dispute has evolved into a moment of cultural relevance, an inflection point in how leadership within sports is viewed. Meanwhile, supporters remain torn between mourning what could have been and admiring the stand he's taken. There's sadness in knowing the fairy tale didn't materialize, the hope of watching Hamilton win a title for Ferrari, climbing out of the red machine in glory, fulfilling a legacy dream. But there's also pride, deep, powerful pride, in witnessing a figure of such stature refusing to be reshaped, repackaged, or reduced. For many, his choice feels bigger than a championship. It feels like a statement of purpose. Hamilton, since releasing his post, has remained completely absent from the public spotlight. No new updates. No clarifications. No scheduled appearances. His silence, rather than diminishing the conversation, has amplified it. People are hanging on every possible clue, analyzing who he unfollows, which brands support him, what his sponsors say. The absence has created a vacuum filled with speculation, but also admiration. Because when someone of his caliber decides to walk away on their own terms, it demands attention. This event, though centered around a Formula One contract, has morphed into a global moment. It challenges the assumptions of what it means to be a leader. It questions the expectations placed on public figures. It reveals the fragile dynamics within elite organizations. And above all, it reminds the world that real power doesn't always lie in staying, but sometimes in leaving, in stepping away with dignity and principle fully intact. And as the dust settles, one thing remains undeniable. Lewis Hamilton may have left Ferrari, but he hasn't left the story. In fact, this may be the moment his story becomes more meaningful than ever. From the very outset, the anticipation surrounding Lewis Hamilton's arrival at Ferrari was overwhelming. It was a union of greatness, a multiple-time world champion aligning with the most celebrated, historic, and emotionally loaded team in the sport's long legacy. The image alone, Hamilton in red, standing beneath the prancing horse, was enough to ignite imaginations across the globe. But beneath the surface of hope, there was always an undercurrent of uncertainty. The textures didn't match. The energy felt disjointed. The Ferrari ecosystem, so rooted in its own traditions, language, and internal rhythm, never quite harmonized with the spirit of a driver who had long walked his own path, on his own terms. As the races unfolded and the calendar progressed, it became increasingly evident that the connection wasn't forming in the way it needed to. What fans initially mistook as a period of adjustment was, in truth, a slow and quiet unraveling. Ferrari, with its deeply embedded customs, hierarchical structure, and unspoken expectations, presented a kind of resistance that went far beyond engineering. It was cultural. It was emotional. Hamilton wasn't just adapting to a new vehicle. He was attempting to integrate himself into an organization whose pulse beat to a rhythm entirely foreign to him. Within the team, communication often felt more transactional than collaborative. Hamilton, known for his emotional intelligence, empathy, and connection to those around him, seemed to be met with formality rather than sincerity. The warmth he had cultivated at Mercedes, where every member of the garage felt like family, was nowhere to be found. Instead, he found himself in a rigid environment where gestures were polite but hollow, and the sense of unity was more symbolic than heartfelt. It was like performing on a stage with no audience, going through motions while the soul remained untouched. There were whispers early on that something wasn't quite right. Engineers who once hung on every word he said now simply nodded and moved on. Strategic insights offered with the weight of experience were filed away rather than explored. Hamilton's vision, sharpened by years of championship battles, seemed undervalued. And then there was the inevitable comparison to Charles Leclerc. Though both maintained professionalism and mutual respect publicly, the underlying reality was that Leclerc was the heart of Ferrari's future. He had roots within the team. He represented its continuity. Hamilton, no matter his accolades, always felt like an outsider trying to break into a circle that had already closed. In that atmosphere, self-doubt grows quietly. He never stopped giving his best. He never stopped training, pushing, fighting. But the silence in return, the lack of emotional reciprocity, became deafening. Every race weekend started to feel heavier. Every missed opportunity lingered longer. It wasn't about results, it was about the invisible weight pressing on his chest every time he stepped into the garage. When you're pouring your soul into a machine and the room around you remains unmoved, something starts to fracture. Eventually, that fracture gave way to something irreparable. The emotional toll reached a point where it could no longer be ignored, masked, or managed. Hamilton, always a master at channeling pain into performance, finally chose to speak, not through media handlers, but directly from his own heart. His words were simple, yet they landed like thunder. I felt useless. Not as a driver, but as a person. In one sentence, he dismantled the carefully built illusion that all was well. That confession exposed the raw truth behind the helmet, a human being pushed to the brink by a system that failed to truly see him. The reaction was instantaneous and visceral. Fans, analysts, even fellow drivers felt the emotional magnitude of what he'd revealed. The decision to withdraw mid-season, without the fanfare or structure typically surrounding such moves, was shocking, but it was also deeply human. It wasn't orchestrated. It wasn't a PR move. It was a man reaching the end of what he could silently endure. Not due to a lack of speed or skill, but because his sense of identity had begun to erode in an environment that never welcomed it in full. Ferrari didn't break Hamilton with strategy errors or technical issues. What broke him was emotional vacancy, the sense that his presence mattered less than his reputation, that his voice echoed without impact, that the person behind the driver was being slowly diminished. For someone who has spent his entire career fighting not only for titles but for dignity, meaning, and justice, the absence of those things made every victory hollow and every defeat unbearable. Now, Formula One finds itself in unfamiliar territory. The most iconic driver of the modern era has chosen to walk away, not for retirement, not for injury, not for failure, but for preservation. It forces everyone to pause, to look beyond the points tables and podiums and ask, what does it cost to stay silent? Because when someone as powerful, as battle-tested, and as resilient as Lewis Hamilton chooses to leave mid-season, it means the damage wasn't superficial, it was foundational. This isn't merely a headline. It's a shift in the way we understand greatness. True greatness isn't just about staying in the car no matter what. Sometimes, it's about getting out while you still remember who you are. Hamilton's choice was not an act of surrender, it was a declaration of self-respect. A message to every driver, every athlete, and every person watching that your mental and emotional well-being are not sacrifices for success, they are requirements. His departure reshapes everything. It changes how we talk about leadership. It alters the conversation around vulnerability in elite competition. It forces us to confront the quiet suffering that so many endure behind the polished image of performance. It places humanity back at the center of a sport too often obsessed with speed at the expense of substance. Hamilton's story will be told for generations, not because he broke records, but because he broke silence. He stood up not just for himself, but for every individual who has ever felt reduced to their output. He didn't just leave a team, he sparked a reckoning. The most courageous moment of his career may not be on any highlight reel. It may be this one, the moment he chose to walk away with his soul intact.